available to those who may not be able to join live. So if you're joining us, this session is being recorded. So as we wait for folks to join, we'll just provide a minute or two here at the top of the session so that we can allow folks to log in and make sure their Zoom is working. And then I will get us started. So thank you again to those who are just signing in here this morning. This session is being recorded, and we'll be getting started here in just a couple of moments. Great. All right. I see that some additional folks are joining. If you're just joining us now, this session is being recorded, and we're going to wait just about one more minute, and then I will get us started with our session today. All right. Well, good morning. Again, thank you all for joining. My name is Joanne Kilgour, and I serve as Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute. We're so pleased that you're with us this morning for the release of our new report, A Cautionary Tale of Petrochemicals from Pennsylvania, authored by Eric DePlace and Molly Kick, who are with us this morning to present their findings and answer any of your questions. This research brief reviews the economic track record of Beaver County, Pennsylvania, since the Shell petrochemical complex was first announced in 2012. Since this project's inception, industry executives and government officials have argued that it would spur local economic growth and renewed business investment. However, our research indicates that the county has actually fallen behind the state and the nation in nearly every measure of economic activity. For this morning's program, we'll provide an overview of the research brief, and then we would be happy to field any questions. So please, either at the end of the comments from our panelists or throughout their presentation, please feel free to submit your questions using the chat or Q&A functions, and I'll facilitate the Q&A at the close of our prepared remarks. So thank you again for joining, and I'm now pleased to hand over the mic to Eric DePlace.
Thanks, Joanne, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to be here. My name is Eric DePlace. As Joanne said, I'm a research fellow with the Ohio River Valley Institute. I've had the privilege of, for the last couple of decades, actually working on economic and environmental analysis in many places across the country. Very excited to be reporting on Beaver County specifically, and a look at Western Pennsylvania today and the petrochemical build out. Also delighted to introduce my colleague, Molly Kick, who's with us. Molly did a whole lot of the heavy lifting with the research and analysis that went into this report. So I want to make sure that Molly gets plenty of credit for what we're able to produce. Really excited to kind of welcome her into the community of folks who do this work. I'll be leading the presentation this morning. You may hear me kick a couple of one or two questions to Molly or others on the phone, but my plan is to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes and then leave plenty of room for questions from folks in the audience. So without further ado, let me dive into my sort of prepared remarks. And I think it's useful to start with a bit of context setting, some of which Joanne just gave in her opening remarks. But the primary place to start is to really think about kind of the petrochemical build out as it was conceived at a national level as long as a decade ago. So if we rewind the clock back to the 2010, 2011, 2012, we were starting to hear that there was a wave of petrochemical build out that was going to happen, but it was going to happen specifically in just a couple of places. One of those places was in Appalachia. And along with that, what a big number of promises. And so we began to see studies, that were suggesting, there was one by the American Chemistry Council suggesting that there would be, tens of thousands of jobs produced, tons and tons of tax revenue produced, all kinds of economic growth. And that's those sort of promises were really interesting to people. And around that same time, Shell, the oil company Shell, announced plans to build a big ethane cracker in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. That ethane cracker, of course, many folks in this call probably already know, but for those of you who may not, the idea was to take advantage of all the fracking in Western Pennsylvania and surrounding areas in Appalachia. The fracking, of course, produces methane gas, which is used as a fuel and a feedstock for other products. But to take some of the associated products that come out of frac wells, the natural gas liquids, and to use those as a feedstock, particularly ethane as a feedstock for producing ethylene and polyethylene, which is then used to make plastics. If we sort of rewind the clock back to the early 2010s, there was a lot of belief based on what the industry said that Appalachia would soon be home to a large build out of petrochemical facilities, including as many as 5 ethane crackers, a gigantic underground storage hub in salt caverns beneath West Virginia, probably another storage hub, a number of pipelines. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, what happened subsequently was that those projects and those ideas ran sort of headlong into the brick wall of the market realities about this. And what the market said, what economic and financial reality said, was that that petchem facility that build out at a regional scale never really made a lot of sense. And so of those, all those projects that were originally announced, three of the big ethane crackers were scrapped. The underground storage hub has never come to fruition. Another, the crackers can't find enough investors or buyers for the product. It's delayed its final investment decision over and over and over again. The only one that did proceed is the one that we're going to talk about today, and that's the Shell cracker in Beaver County. Now, most of what we'll talk about today is, it seems on some level very localized, because we're going to take a close look at what happened on the ground, what the facts are on the ground in Beaver County, and compare that to some other locations. But Beaver County is actually really important from a national perspective too, because it's one of the places where we can look to see, well, what happens in a locality when there is a large-scale industrial petrochemical buildout. Does the place get richer? Does it struggle? What happens in a place like that? And so what Molly and I have done is try to provide as comprehensive an overview as possible of economic performance in Beaver County. That's useful, I think, to policymakers in Beaver County and Pennsylvania. I think it's also useful to policymakers in lots of other places, because it's one of the few times that we can look back and say, well, what happened on the ground? What does the scoreboard actually say? That is, not look at some sort of projection or model or industry funded study about what could happen in the future, but what actually happened on the ground. And so that's kind of the substance of the report today. And I'm going to walk us through the findings of the report in just a moment. One more sort of preliminary remark that will help make the analysis, I think, a little more intelligible. We started our analysis in 2012, and 2012 is important in this case because it was in 2012 that Shell first announced that it was going to build this ethane cracker facility in Beaver County. So after 2012, if you're a business, you can decide where you want to locate, you can decide where you want to hire employees. After 2012, if you're a resident, you can decide how what you want to do, where you want to go. And so that, I think, is the sort of a good reference point. There's some other reference points along the way that are really interesting. Groundbreaking happened in 2015 at the site. Major construction started in 2017 at the site. That's when you really got an influx of thousands of construction workers to build this facility. And of course, COVID hit in 2019. That affected everybody all over the world. And so what we tried to do is provide a complete timeline for Beaver County so that anybody can look and see what happened in the intervening years. And we tried to make it as complete and as timely as possible. So without further ado, I'm sort of going to jump into the substance of the findings, starting with what I think is probably the most common indicator of economic performance, and that's GDP, or gross domestic product. And what we find for GDP is that since 2012, American GDP grew by a healthy clip and has continued at a steady rate. It's also grown in Pennsylvania, not quite as fast, but pretty strong GDP growth. In Beaver County, that's not the case, unfortunately. GDP fell from 2012 all the way until 2016. Then for the next 2 years, there was some GDP growth in Beaver County, possibly associated with the influx of construction at that site, possibly not. And then it's plateaued and may even be, well, we haven't seen any further growth in Beaver County. At the end of the day, Beaver County fell behind both the state of Pennsylvania and the United States in GDP growth pretty substantially since that project started. You would often hear, nobody really knows what the price tag for that project is. Some people estimate it at $6 billion. Some people think it could be a lot more than that. But what you don't see is that $6 billion flowing into Beaver County. You see a price tag for the project in general, with money being spent maybe somewhere, but it doesn't appear to be locally, at least not reflected in a way in the GDP figures that would allow Beaver County to report anything looking like strong GDP growth. Next indicator we looked at is population growth. So state of Pennsylvania since 2012 has been pretty steady in terms of population. Not a lot of, I think it's a minor amount of growth, but not a tremendous amount. US growth has been pretty strong. Modest population growth every year since 2012. But in Beaver County, it's the opposite story. In Beaver County, there's been a steady population decline in every year since 2012. And there's no indication that that trend is going to reverse, whether or not the petrochemical facility is built and operated as planned. But we have seen the number of people in Beaver County declining. The third indicator that we looked at is employment. And this was, to me, the most surprising of the findings, because what it shows is something that you wouldn't expect to see in a place that is bringing in, according to the company's estimates, 6,000 temporary construction workers. What you see when you look at employment statistics is, at minimum, Beaver County falls behind employment growth in the state of Pennsylvania, falls behind employment growth in the for the United States. But it actually may have lost employment. There actually may be fewer employed people now in Beaver County than there were in 2012 when the project was first announced. So with many of these indicators, we tried to provide as comprehensive a view as possible. So there's not sort of cherry picking, one set of data or one piece of analysis, but tried to provide a comprehensive view. We actually looked at the 3 primary measurements of employment, all of which track slightly different features. So you can, but we provided all of those analysis in the report. 2 of the 3 show that on net from 2012 to the most recent data available, Beaver County has lost employment. One of them does show growth, as I indicated, a small amount of growth that's happened in the last couple of years, but still not enough to catch up with the net growth in Pennsylvania or the country. We also looked at poverty and child poverty. There are 2 primary ways to measure both poverty and child poverty. So we looked at both of those, of course, and those looking at all, so 2 on poverty and 2 on child poverty, those together, those sort of 4 trends help. When you look at more than one data set, you often can sort of corroborate findings, and this is one where the stories are all pretty similar. And what you see is from 2012 to 2020, some positive news in the state of Pennsylvania and in the United States, where we are seeing slow but steady reductions in both poverty and child poverty. For those of you who may not know, the poverty rate is a single income threshold that's adjusted for inflation. It's assigned to the entire country. So it's a number, for a single person household, for a 2-person household, 2 wage earners and 2 kids, whatever. And so that number is applied nationally, and it's been dropping again, slowly but steadily at the national level, at the state level. But unfortunately not in Beaver County, where the poverty rate and the child poverty rate has remained constant and may have risen a little bit during this period. So when you look at the statistics, not a lot of evidence that the petrochemical build out in Beaver County is having a positive impact on lower income households. Next, we looked at income growth in, again, Beaver County, Pennsylvania, and the United States. This is the bright spot for Beaver County. This is, I think, the most positive news that for the county that we were able to find. So what we looked at is median income, which is the measurement. It's the exact midpoint of income range. So half of all households earn more than the median, half of all households earn less. We also looked at two different ways of calculating per capita personal income, which is a slightly different calculation. That's all the income that's produced in an area divided by the number of people or the number of earners. And all three of those tell a pretty similar story, which is that Beaver County income growth did happen, and it happened at about almost exactly the same rate as it happened at the state of Pennsylvania and the United States. So Beaver County wasn't sort of moving ahead of those two other geographies, but it was keeping pace, and it may have, according to at least one of them, it may have actually slightly outperformed. So that was good news for the residents of Beaver County. And then we looked at the growth in businesses, the change in the number of businesses. There are, with this indicator, at least three primary ways to calculate the number of businesses, the business firms or business establishments, the definitions of which we can sort of get into later if we want. And looking at this indicator, I think, is really important because one of the primary claims that the backers of the project had talked about was that if you were to build the Shell ethane cracker, what you would see then is the creation of all kinds of other businesses springing up around it, induced and indirect and other kinds of opportunities, either directly related to that plant and to ethane cracking and plastics manufacturing, or other businesses that were supporting them. And unfortunately, the data does not bear that out at all. So we saw over the period from 2012 to 2020 or 2021 in one case, steady growth at the national level, less strong, but still steady growth at the state level for Pennsylvania. And unfortunately, in Beaver County, even now, there are fewer businesses in Beaver County than there were at 2012 when the project was announced. Now, each of these three indicators of businesses showed slightly different trends in between, but they corroborate one another in the sense that either Beaver County has not added any businesses on net, or it's lost a small number of them, it's lost a few, which I think is sort of disappointing. So I guess a sort of a few concluding remarks, and I'll wrap up in just a couple of minutes. All of the data that we cite in this report, all of it is from US government agencies. All of it is publicly available online. We provide extensive notation and citation in this report, so anybody can go back, find this data and reproduce it themselves with a little bit of math. We're, of course, happy to talk folks through the analysis anytime. And one of the things that I think is distinctive about the analysis that Molly and I have worked on is that we're looking at the facts on the ground. We're looking at sort of the scoreboard and saying what actually happened in this place. This is different from the sort of analysis that uses data that's either publicly or not publicly available, uses some model-based projection forecast to come up with what might happen in the future. This is a look at what's actually happened on the ground. Now, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. And it could be that there will be lots of economic growth. It could be that, as a study from Robert Morris University indicated in summer of 2021, perhaps this facility in Beaver County will unleash hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenue and all kinds of GDP growth. I would encourage all of us to go back and let's, in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years, let's go back and review the record. Let's look at what actually happened on the ground, so that we can either corroborate or correct the findings in reports like that, because I think it will be interesting. We haven't seen it yet, but it may happen in the future. So there is a picture of the future that could look pretty rosy. The RMU study is one example of that. There are also lots of analyses that paint a pretty grim picture of what the future could look like. And so we've seen analysis from the Institute for Economic and Financial Analysis, for Energy and Economic and Financial Analysis, sometimes called IEFA. They have really called into question some big issues of risk and profitability. The Ohio River Valley Institute also produced a report like that recently, again, calling into question kind of the financial prospects for this facility. we've seen some similar kind of question raising and red flag waving analysis from the industry itself, even from industry analysts. And then it's also worth mentioning that Shell is undergoing some sort of corporate restructuring as they sort of move toward focusing on decarbonization and low carbon efforts. Those two probably raise questions about the prospects for this facility, and especially when taken in context of the struggles that the petrochemical build out has had region wide. I think it is fair to say that the economic and financial case for ethane cracking in Appalachia, it's not a particularly strong case. I think that's a defensible statement. But regardless, I think it is useful for all of us to continue to look at the facts on the ground as comprehensively as possible, not try to cherry pick, a little story here, a little story there, an anecdote there, but to really kind of get the numbers right and to do it in a fair and public and open way. And I think one of the reasons why that's important is because a lot of us make decisions about what to do with our businesses, what to do with our lives, what to do with our tax subsidies and public policies based on what we're told will happen. And what we were told in the past about a project like this is that it would unleash all kinds of economic growth and prosperity. On the strength of those claims, the state of Pennsylvania passed a tax subsidy tailor-made for this project in Beaver County that is estimated to be worth $1.65 billion. It's by far the biggest tax subsidy in Pennsylvania state history, probably one of the biggest state tax subsidies anywhere. The belief was that if the state provided tax subsidies, that the state would get something back in return in the form of economic growth. And so far we haven't seen that. And I think that getting the facts right will help policymakers make decisions about whether they should extend tax subsidies like that, whether they should curtail them, whether we should invest in this form of economic development or a different kind. But again, hopefully the sort of data we provide in this report can provide a shared foundation for understanding how to make decisions, not just in Beaver County and Pennsylvania, that's very important, but also nationally for other places that are evaluating petrochemicals and thinking about whether a build out makes sense. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks. I look forward to Q&A. Thanks again to Molly for the hard work she did making this report possible, and also to my colleagues, Ben and Joanne, for putting on the session today, and to all of you for being here this morning. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. So we will be now having an opportunity for question and answer. For those who've joined Zoom via computer, please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function. And if you've joined via phone, we do have some call-in participants. We'd still like to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So you can do that by using the raise your hand function, and then we can unmute you to allow you to ask your question live. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 as a shortcut to let us know that you'd like us to unmute you and ask a question. So while we get started here, I have just a quick question for you both, which is, earlier in November, the Ohio River Valley Institute released a report titled "Poor Economics for Virgin Plastics. Petrochemicals will not provide sustainable business opportunities in Appalachia." And I was wondering if you could just say whether this new evaluation of the economic conditions observed in Beaver County supports the findings that were articulated in that earlier report.
Yeah, that's a great question, Joanne. Thanks for posing that. And in a moment, I may give Molly a chance to weigh in if she'd like to, but I think it is, at a high level, I think it certainly corroborates those findings. And I think together, the report that you referred to, which looks at kind of the economic and financial prospects for ethane cracking in Appalachia and in Beaver County specifically, and it raises a number of questions about why there's a lot of risk there, and why there's a lot of uncertainty there, and why it's that report really helps explain why this big, huge petrochemical buildout that was supposed to happen in Appalachia, why that buildout never happened. That buildout never happened because of economic and financial realities that the industry ran into, that it doesn't make a ton of sense. So I think that report provided a lot of explanatory power, and I think what we've done today in the report is sort of provide, kind of looking at the question from a slightly different perspective. Like, well, what was the net impact of this at a local level? Unfortunately, the net impact at a local level is it's pretty hard to discern a positive one. I think more analysis is always welcome, but it's kind of tough to see. And I don't know, I'll now actually shut up for a second to give Molly a chance if she would like to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I think you covered it. I think you're right that I think today's report shows that the expected economic benefits, at least as far as we can tell, haven't been seen. And I think there was an anticipated build out that hasn't happened. And you're right, I think looking at the two reports together kind of answers that question of why.
Thank you very much. Our first question asks, were any benefits proven for other counties or states beyond Beaver County or Pennsylvania? And in other words, did someone profit from all of this investment? And if so, do we know who?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what a great question. For this report, we looked really closely at Beaver County, particularly, and then we also compared it to the state of Pennsylvania, to the United States. Presumably somebody makes money from a petrochemical project, and that's either the workers on site. Those are real jobs, and in no way does this report try to suggest that those jobs aren't really are people working in construction at that site. Now, what's interesting is that in some ways, the conditions in Beaver County that we're reporting now may actually be sort of a high watermark for Beaver County. And I'm going to sort of answer that question a little more directly in a second, but I think this piece of context is important. What we've seen in the report we've provided now, that's to look at Beaver County, where there are 6,000 people at work on that site now. They're gonna leave that soon. When that project becomes fully constructed and operational, which is probably next year or the year after, then the number of people on the site goes from 6,000 to 600 at most. And so that's 5,400 people who will leave the employment roles in Beaver County, who will, if they're already located in Beaver County, not all of them are, but some of them are, they'll leave, they may leave the county. And so that creates a big challenge. And it could be that the picture we're painting of Beaver County right now is actually the rosiest picture possible, because of that reduction in the workforce. So there is money that is going to some places, but on net, when you look at the county as a whole, you're seeing reductions in businesses, reduction in employment, poverty that's either stable or growing, and on and on and on. I think it would be worth doing the same analysis in other places that have conducted a petrochemical build out. There are lots of places around the country, which I can kind of dig into a little later, but in this conversation if we'd like. But there isn't, as far as I'm aware, a way of looking at, or nobody has to date done an analysis where they've looked at what happened in the river parishes or Cancer Alley, where there was a big petrochemical buildup. What happened to Port Arthur or Beaumont, Texas, where there's been a big petrochemical? Did those places get richer or poorer? I think that would be a really interesting analysis. As far as we know, it seems like the money and the profits from these projects are going to the corporate office in Houston. They're going to the corporate office in London, or farther away than that. We're not able to find strong evidence that the net economic activity from these things is producing that economic benefit in the local area, at least not in Beaver County. And so that's why I think this analysis is interesting. Apologies for sort of rambling on with that answer, but hopefully that at least spoke to a few of the elements there.
Thank you. We have another question that may go beyond the scope of this particular report, but they ask, we've only discussed economic impacts today. Do you have any insight on possible social impacts? So there are some negative social impacts that have been publicly discussed, such as increases in STDs, drug use, and mental health issues in the community. And are we able to speak to this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's outside the scope of this report. For this report, we really tried to focus in a narrow sense on economic performance, observable economic performance, publicly available data in Beaver County. Anecdotally, there are lots of stories, particularly in areas where there's a lot of fracking, but also in places like Beaver County that, an influx of construction workers can bring with it some social problems, including STDs, drug use, other things are claimed to. We do not in this report have a perspective on that. I think it's certainly worth studying. There are again lots of studies. I don't know if there are studies, but there are lots of anecdotes from sort of oil producing regions like the Bakken, where this was allegedly a big issue. But to be fair, I mean, anybody who looks at that question should also look at are there social improvements that happen from bringing in new workers from other places. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's certainly a worthy question that would help provide a fuller perspective for policymakers than economic performance. So I would very much welcome somebody conducting that analysis.
Thank you. So Eric, you've mentioned some of this in your comments, but Molly, I wonder if you'd be willing to just cover some of the sources that were relied upon for this analysis, so that if anyone wants to either go into the report and see some of the citations or pull some of the numbers for themselves, they might be able to do that.
Sure, I'd be happy to mention a few. As Eric mentioned, they're all publicly available and they're also extensively linked in the report. So hopefully they're easy to find the specific links. But some of the major sources included the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the American Community Survey, and then a few sources within the Census Bureau, the Small Area Income Poverty Estimate. I believe I got that right, SAIPE, but all publicly available government data sources.
Great, thank you. So we do have time for a couple more questions if anyone would like to ask either in the chat or the question and answer. And then Eric and Molly have also kindly offered to be available after this session if anyone would like to do any direct follow-up or have additional questions that we may not get to during this session. Eric and Molly, is there anything that we did not cover that you'd like to share with our audience today?
I guess I'd like to thank everybody for joining us, and I do, hope that analyses like this can provide a sort of common level of understanding. There's been an awful lot of heated debate over the wisdom of building a petrochemical facility in Beaver County. I think there are lots of arguments on both sides that are sort of valid and understandable. And I hope that this analysis can provide a way for everybody to sort of come to the table with a common understanding of the facts on the ground. And I hope that I know that speaking for ORVI, for the Ohio River Valley Institute, we will continue to take a look at these economic performance indicators over time to see whether things get better, whether they get worse, to see what the changes. I hope that everyone is able to do that. And I hope that it's something that other places are able to look at when they're making decisions about whether an ethane cracker is the right decision for their community. Hopefully this data for Beaver County will provide some sort of fact-based evidence for those, and also I think with the formation of tax subsidies, because a tax subsidy, as in the case in Pennsylvania, is very often framed as we're going to give something in order to get something back. There's an explicit belief that there's a return on investment, and so rather than looking at sort of model-based projections for what could happen in the future, it's really important that we say, are we the public getting something back as a return on the investment we're making with our tax dollars.
Thank you. So Eric, you have started to touch on this in that response, but building on a question that's come in through the chat, there have been other proposed petrochemical facilities in the region, including the PTTGC facility in Ohio and other facilities in West Virginia. Do you have any suggestions about how this report could inform either communities that are in areas where facilities have been proposed, or other decision makers in the region who are facing uncertainty about additional facilities?
Yeah. Well, I do hope it's useful to communities in West Virginia and Ohio and other places that are still debating these questions, because it will provide a way to sort of, as I said earlier, sort of, we can sort of corroborate the industry story, we can correct the industry story about what will happen if we start a project like this. No two communities are completely alike, of course. The future is unknown, of course. But the facts on the ground don't tell a story that's very supportive of petrochemical build out. Now, there may be strong benefits for the corporate owners, there may be strong benefits for some people, but the net effect at the local level in Beaver County is pretty clearly a story of economic decline, not a story of economic growth. So I think, again, providing, a clear portrayal of publicly available facts about economic performance can be useful for any community. The other thing I would add for projects that were proposed in West Virginia and also Southeast Ohio is that there was a lot of push for those projects. The Department of Energy under the previous administration, many other local and regional business entities pushing hard for that build out on the belief that it would produce economic growth. And as I mentioned in my remarks earlier, I mean, that stuff simply did not get built, and it didn't get built because it ran into some sophisticated set of opposition. Didn't get built because the economic and financial realities won't support them, and that there just isn't, the market does not want to bring on large scale ethane cracking in Appalachia from 5 different ethane crackers, or the Appalachian Storage Hub, which was this giant underground storage facility that was proposed to store natural gas liquids. That's just, the market can be pretty harsh, and that's what the market has said pretty clearly. And so I think that stuff actually poses real risk for the ethane cracker that's in Beaver County under construction right now, which was the first one and the only one ever to get started. I think that the business case there may actually be pretty weak. So, I think between the sort of the business case and the performance on the ground, I do hope that's informative for decision makers in West Virginia and other parts of the country.
Thank you. So we have a couple more comments and questions. One comment came in through the chat, which is, it seems that the taxpayers in the state have subsidized corporate gain, not real economic development for the region. Would you say that comment is consistent with the findings just for the Beaver County snapshot analysis?
I think it's a very accurate summary of it. I mean, there's no question that the state has provided huge subsidies for this particular facility. And there's no question that the economic performance in Beaver County doesn't show growth. So I think the statement is well framed.
And then we have one additional question, which is, I realize this is a newly released report to the public, but curious if the community or industry has had a chance to see the data. I'll be curious to hear how the community may respond and how industry may respond. And of course, the state after giving such a large tax break.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see the answer to all that too. So today is the release of the report. So everyone is welcome to take a look at it, but all of this data, all of it has been publicly available all the time since 2012. None of this is a secret. All of this is easily accessible from US government data sources. It's all widely vetted and used by economists regularly. So nothing in here should be a surprise to anyone, but it is the first time that anybody's put it all together and looked at economic performance in a comprehensive and consistent way through time. And then, that part may be a surprise, but I would be, I'll be really interested to see, what state policymakers think about, whether there's been a return on investment from that subsidy, just for one example. I do know that a little bit before our press briefing this morning, that one industry group sent out a pretty half-baked analysis that was kind of cherry picking a few numbers. I imagine there'll be some attempt to do that, but what we don't have, and I think that will be useful for everyone is again this kind of comprehensive look at the economic performance in a way that everyone can get their hands on and talk about.
Thank you. And then I can just share also that, I think for a lot of communities that have experienced various portions of the oil and gas or fossil fuel industry, it's often frustrating because there feels like a disconnect between your lived experience and what the media or elected officials or the industry is saying about your community. So I do think that, one of the things we've heard since releasing the report is that this really is a confirmation for a lot of people of their lived experience, and a sense that, being in a community like Beaver that has been so heavily discussed as part of this, national and statewide view into the petrochemical and oil and gas industry, that it's helpful, as Eric mentioned, to have this information organized and presented in a way that tells an aggregate story from publicly available information, because even though it's out there for everyone to access, it does take a certain amount of skill and analysis to put that together. And so with that, I'd like to just, really thank Molly and Eric for their work in presenting that analysis and doing the work of looking at those numbers and presenting them in a way that's accessible, not just to us here today, but also to community members who really are living, in the shadow of this facility and, continuing to work through the community and economic impact. So thank you both very much. Thank you to everyone who's attended today, and Ben for your organizing and support of this event. Again, we are happy to be available for questions after this session and look forward to continuing to engage on the subject matter. So with that, I'll say thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.